Widow loses everything to greedy landlord, but fate has other plans. The rain pounded against the fragile rooftop as Sarah Dawson clutched the final eviction notice in her trembling hands. Her heart ached, not just from the weight of her own despair, but from the terrified eyes of her 12-year-old daughter Emma. They had nowhere to go, no savings, no family left to call. The house Daniel had built with his own hands, the last piece of him she had, was slipping away. And Vincent Carter, the ruthless landlord, didn't care. He wanted them out, tonight. But as Sarah wiped her tears, she had no idea that fate was about to change everything. The cold autumn wind howled through the cracks in the tiny wooden house, making the thin curtains flutter like ghostly figures in the dim candlelight. Sarah Dawson sat on the edge of the worn-out couch, her fingers clutched around an old family photo. It was the last thing she had of her late husband, Daniel, the man who had promised her forever but was taken too soon. The house wasn't much, but it was home. It was where she had raised her daughter, Emma, where Daniel had once built bookshelves with his own hands, where love had filled the air even in the hardest of times. But love wasn't enough to keep a roof over their heads, not when the world showed no mercy to a struggling widow. A sharp knock rattled the door, and Sarah's heart jumped. She knew who it was before she even stood up. Mrs. Dawson. The voice on the other side was sharp and impatient. With a deep breath, Sarah opened the door to face Vincent Carter, the landlord who had made her life unbearable for the past 6 months. He stood tall in his expensive suit, his graying hair slicked back, eyes cold and calculating. Beside him, a younger man held a clipboard, the eviction notice she had been dreading. "Your payment is late." "Again," Vincent said, his voice dripping with feigned politeness. "I've been more than generous, Mrs. Dawson, but generosity has its limits." Sarah swallowed hard. "Please, Mr. Carter, I just need a little more time. I have a job interview next week. I can start catching up on rent soon." Vincent sighed dramatically and stepped inside without invitation. His gaze swept over the small living room, the threadbare rug, the mismatched furniture. He sneered. "I don't think you understand. This property is valuable, and I have buyers lined up. I can't afford to wait on false promises." Tears burned at the back of Sarah's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I have nowhere else to go," she said quietly. Vincent clicked his tongue. "Not my problem. You have 3 days to vacate." He turned to the man beside him. "Make sure the paperwork is filed. I want her out by Friday." And just like that, he was gone, leaving Sarah standing in the doorway, her world crumbling around her. Emma, barely 12, peeked from behind the kitchen counter, her wide brown eyes filled with fear. "Mom, what's going to happen to us?" Sarah knelt beside her daughter, pulling her into a tight embrace. "We're going to be okay, sweetheart," she whispered, even though she had no idea how. But fate had a strange way of working, and Sarah's story wasn't over yet. The wind howled through the thin walls of the house, rattling the windows as Sarah Dawson sat frozen on the couch, staring at the eviction notice in her hands. The words blurred through the tears she refused to let fall. 3 days. That was all she had left before she and Emma would be thrown out onto the streets with nowhere to go. Emma sat curled up on the other end of the couch, hugging her knees, her face pale with worry. At just 12 years old, she understood far more than she should. Life had forced her to grow up too fast after Daniel's death. She didn't ask Sarah if they would be okay. She already knew her mother would lie, forcing a brave smile, trying to protect her from the brutal truth. Sarah reached out and brushed a strand of Emma's chestnut hair behind her ear. "We'll figure something out," she whispered. But how? The last year had been a nightmare. After Daniel's sudden death in a construction accident, Sarah had struggled to make ends meet. His life insurance barely covered the medical bills, and with no family to turn to, she had been drowning ever since. She had taken whatever job she could, cleaning houses, waitressing, even babysitting. But nothing was enough to keep up with the rising rent and overdue utilities. And Vincent Carter knew it. He had never liked the Dawsons, always seeing them as beneath him. Even when Daniel was alive, Vincent had looked down on them, treating them like nothing more than tenants occupying space he could use for something more profitable. When Daniel died, it was as if he had been waiting for the moment to pounce. Sarah had tried everything, pleading for extensions, offering to work off the rent, but Vincent was unmoved. Business is business, he had said the last time she begged him for time. Now, he was finally making his move. A sharp knock on the door jolted Sarah from her thoughts. Her heart pounded as she stood, dreading another visit from Vincent or his assistant. She hesitated, then slowly turned the knob. A woman stood on the doorstep, her auburn hair tucked into a neat bun, her sharp green eyes filled with something between sympathy and hesitation. She wore a dark blue coat and clutched a leather folder against her chest. "Mrs. Dawson?" "Yes," Sarah said warily. The woman gave her a small, professional smile. "I'm Rachel Carter, Vincent Carter's daughter." Sarah stiffened. Another Carter, another person coming to remind her that she was losing everything. Rachel must have seen the tension in Sarah's face because she sighed and shifted on her feet. "Look, I know my father has been difficult, but I wanted to come here personally because I think there may be another way." Sarah narrowed her eyes. "Another way?" Rachel hesitated, then glanced inside, her gaze briefly landing on Emma, who was still curled up on the couch, pretending not to listen. When she looked back at Sarah, her expression softened. "I want to help," she said. Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "Help? Your father is throwing me and my daughter onto the street, and you want to help." Rachel winced. "I know how he operates, and I know it isn't fair. That's why I came here, without him knowing. I work in real estate, and I've been trying to convince him to sell me some of his lower-income properties, so I can turn them into affordable housing." She hesitated, then added, "Including this house?" Sarah's breath caught. "You want to buy this house?" Rachel nodded. "I'm offering you a deal, one that doesn't end with you and your daughter homeless. But we have to act fast. If my father finds out, he'll shut it down before we even get started." Sarah's mind raced. Could she trust her? Was this a trick? But as she looked into Rachel's eyes, she saw something different from Vincent's cold, calculating greed. Rachel wasn't her father. For the first time in months, hope flickered in Sarah's heart. But fate had more surprises in store. This deepens a conflict and introduces a potential twist. Let me know if you want to continue with this direction. Sarah stared at Rachel Carter, her mind spinning. It was hard to believe that someone with the last name Carter could be offering help instead of pushing her toward the curb. For a moment, she wanted to trust Rachel, desperately needed to, but life had taught her that good things were always just out of reach. Emma, still curled up on the couch, watched them with wide eyes. She may have been young, but she understood far more than Sarah wished she did. "What's the catch?" Sarah asked finally, crossing her arms over her chest. "Because there's always a catch." Rachel exhaled, looking down at the leather folder in her hands. "It won't be easy. My father's a shrewd businessman, and he's not going to let this house go without a fight. I've been trying to negotiate with him for months, but he only cares about profit. If he finds out I'm trying to buy this place before he sells it to the developers, he'll shut me down immediately." Sarah frowned. "Then how do you expect to pull this off?" Rachel looked up, determination flashing in her green eyes. "We go behind his back." Sarah stiffened. "And if he finds out?" Rachel gave a small, wry smile. "He'll disown me, cut me off. But I'm prepared for that." Sarah's lips parted slightly. This woman was willing to go against her own father? That was hard to believe. She wanted to ask why. Why help her? A struggling widow Vincent clearly had no respect for. Rachel must have read her thoughts because she hesitated before speaking. "Look, I know my father's reputation. I know what he's done to people like you. And I've spent most of my life trying to undo the damage he's caused." She took a deep breath. "This house isn't just a deal to me, Sarah. It's a chance to make things right." Sarah wanted to believe her. But trust wasn't something she could afford to give easily. Before she could respond, another knock sounded at the door, loud and impatient. Her stomach clenched. Rachel's face tensed. "That's him," she whispered. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She turned toward Emma, who immediately shrank back into the couch cushions. Forcing her hands to stay steady, Sarah walked to the door and pulled it open. Vincent Carter stood there, a smug smile on his face. Behind him, two men in dark suits loomed, making the small front porch feel even smaller. "Well," Vincent said, his voice dripping with false politeness, "I see my daughter's already here. That saves me the trouble of explaining things twice." He stepped forward, but Sarah didn't move aside. He frowned. "Let me in?" No, his eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" Sarah squared her shoulders. "This is still my home. You don't have the right to barge in whenever you feel like it." Vincent chuckled, shaking his head. "That's where you're wrong, Mrs. Dawson. You see, your time is up. I was going to give you until Friday, but I've decided to move things along. I have a buyer ready to sign the papers today. You and your daughter need to be out by morning." A cold dread filled Sarah's chest. "You can't do that." Vincent's smirk widened. "I can, and I am." He turned his gaze to Rachel. "And you, what are you doing here?" Rachel didn't flinch under his stare. "I'm here because I want to make an offer on the house." Vincent's smile faltered for just a second before he threw his head back and laughed. "You want to buy this place?" "Rachel, don't be ridiculous." He turned to Sarah. "My daughter is young and idealistic. She doesn't understand how the world works. But I do. And I'm telling you now, this house is gone." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. She had never felt more powerless. But then she glanced at Rachel, who stood tall, unwavering. Rachel met her father's eyes and said, "We'll see about that." For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt something stir inside her. It wasn't just fear. It was hope. A tense silence filled the doorway. Sarah could feel Emma's gaze on her, feel the way her daughter's small body trembled just behind her. She wanted to scream, to cry, to beg Vincent for mercy, but she knew it would be useless. He had already made up his mind. Vincent leaned against the doorframe, his smirk unwavering. "Rachel, let's not drag this out. You know I won't sell to you. And Sarah," he turned his piercing gaze back to her, "you've lost. Start packing." Sarah clenched her fists. "Where do you expect us to go?" "That's not my problem," Vincent said with a shrug. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you fell behind on rent." A quiet, bitter laugh escaped Sarah before she could stop it. "Fell behind?" she echoed. "Do you even know what it's like to lose someone you love? To fight every day just to keep a roof over your child's head?" For a brief second, something flickered in Vincent's eyes. Something almost human. But it was gone just as quickly as it appeared. He sighed, feigning sympathy. "This is business, Mrs. Dawson. Nothing personal." Rachel stepped forward, her jaw set. "You're making a mistake." Vincent turned to her, irritation flashing across his face. "And you're wasting your time." Rachel didn't back down. "You always talk about profit, but you don't see the bigger picture. This neighborhood is changing, and if you work with the community instead of against it, you'd still make money, without ruining people's lives." Vincent scoffed. "That's adorable, Rachel, but naive." Sarah knew Rachel was fighting a losing battle. Vincent wasn't the kind of man who could be reasoned with, and yet Rachel's presence gave her strength. Sarah took a shaky breath and met Vincent's gaze. "I won't leave without a fight." Vincent tilted his head, amused. "A fight? What exactly do you plan to do?" Sarah hesitated. She didn't have a plan. She had nothing. But before she could speak, Rachel stepped in. "She'll fight legally," Rachel said, "because you may own this property, but you don't own everything. And I have some connections that might be very interested in looking into your business practices." For the first time, Vincent's smirk faded. "Careful, Rachel." "Or what?" Rachel challenged. You'll cut me off? You already did that the day you started putting money over people's lives. Vincent's face hardened. You have until tomorrow, Sarah. If you're not out, I'll have you removed. He turned on his heel and walked away, his men following close behind. Sarah closed the door, her hands shaking. She had less than 24 hours to figure something out. Rachel turned to her. I have an idea, but it's risky. Sarah exhaled. At this point, I don't care. Tell me. Rachel took a deep breath. We're going to expose him. Sarah's heart pounded as she processed Rachel's words. Expose him? She wasn't sure what that meant, but at this point, she had nothing left to lose. Rachel pulled out her phone and began typing furiously. My father's been bending the law for years, manipulating contracts, forcing tenants out, and selling properties under the table. If we can prove it, we can stop him. Sarah frowned. But how? He's careful. He wouldn't leave a paper trail. Rachel looked up, determination burning in her green eyes. Maybe not one we can access easily, but I know where he keeps everything. His office. If we can get in, I might be able to find something, a shady deal, an illegal eviction, something that could force him to back off. Sarah hesitated. This wasn't just standing up to Vincent. It was actively working against him. And if we get caught, Rachel swallowed hard. Then we'll have a much bigger problem. Emma, who had been silent this entire time, finally spoke up. Mom, I think you should do it. Sarah turned to her daughter, surprised. Emma, no, Emma interrupted. He's taken everything from us. He doesn't care what happens to us. But if we don't fight back, he wins. Sarah stared at her daughter, her little girl who had grown up far too fast. She realized Emma was right. Sarah took a deep breath and nodded. Okay, what's the plan? Rachel glanced at the clock. My father leaves his office at 8. We go in after that. The weight of the decision settled over Sarah. This was dangerous, but if it meant keeping her home, keeping Emma safe, she would do whatever it took. As night fell, Sarah and Rachel stood outside Carter Enterprises, their nerves on edge. The next few hours would change everything, and there was no turning back now. Sarah gripped the strap of her worn-out purse, her pulse hammering as she and Rachel stood outside Carter Enterprises. The sleek glass building towered above them, its bright security lights making the night feel colder. She exhaled slowly, trying to steady her nerves. This is crazy, Sarah whispered. Breaking into his office? We could get arrested. Rachel shot her a determined look. We're not breaking in. I have a key. She pulled it from her coat pocket and held it up. I used to work here before my father pushed me out. My badge might still get us in. Sarah clenched her fists. And if it doesn't? Rachel hesitated but then straightened. Then we improvise. Sarah swallowed hard. She wasn't the type to take risks. She'd spent her life avoiding trouble, keeping her head down, doing what she had to do for Emma. But Vincent had left her with no choice. If they didn't find something to use against him, she and her daughter would be on the street by morning. Rachel scanned the sidewalk, checking for anyone who might be watching, then swiped her badge at the back entrance. A small green light blinked and the door clicked open. Sarah let out a breath of relief. Okay, we're in. They stepped into the dimly lit hallway, the quiet hum of the building's overnight systems filling the silence. Rachel led the way, her heels clicking against the polished floors. Sarah followed close behind, her heart racing with every step. The place smelled like expensive cologne and fresh coffee, a stark contrast to the reality of what Vincent had done to struggling families like hers. Rachel stopped in front of an office door with a gold plaque. Vincent Carter, CEO. This is it, Rachel whispered. She pulled another key from her pocket and slipped it into the lock. With a soft click, the door swung open. Sarah hesitated before stepping inside. The office was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. A leather chair sat behind a large mahogany desk, and shelves lined the walls, filled with books and framed awards. It was the office of a man who believed he was untouchable. Rachel wasted no time. She moved to the desk and turned on the computer. The glow of the screen illuminated her face as she typed quickly. Sarah hovered near the door, her hands clammy. What exactly are we looking for? Anything that proves he's illegally evicting tenants or laundering money through these deals. Rachel clicked through folders, her brows furrowing. I know he keeps records. He always does. Minutes passed in tense silence. Sarah kept glancing at the door, afraid someone would walk in at any moment. Then Rachel gasped. Here, I found something. Sarah rushed over as Rachel pointed at the screen. Look at this. Documents showing that my father forged eviction notices. He's been falsifying complaints to force people out. She scrolled further. And here, wire transfers to an offshore account. He's been pocketing money meant for building renovations. Sarah's stomach twisted. So he could have fixed the plumbing, repaired the roofs, he just chose not to. Rachel clenched her jaw. Exactly. Sarah felt a surge of anger, stronger than any she had felt before. Vincent hadn't just taken her home. He had been stealing from everyone. Rachel pulled out a flash drive and inserted it into the computer. I'm copying everything. Sarah's breath hitched. How long will it take? Rachel glanced at the loading bar. A few more minutes. Just then, the office door handle rattled. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Rachel's eyes went wide. Someone's coming. They barely had seconds to react. Rachel yanked the flash drive out, shoved it into her pocket, and shut off the computer. The door burst open, and standing there, his face dark with fury, was Vincent Carter. Vincent's eyes darkened as he stepped inside, shutting the door behind him with a quiet click. The room suddenly felt smaller, suffocating. What, he said, his voice low and dangerous, do you think you're doing? Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. She instinctively stepped in front of Rachel, shielding her like she would Emma. We know what you've done, she said, her voice steadier than she expected. The forged eviction notices. The stolen renovation funds. We have proof. Vincent's lips curled into a smirk, but there was no amusement in his eyes. Proof. He took a slow step toward them. And what exactly do you plan to do with it? Rachel lifted her chin. Expose you. Vincent let out a humorless chuckle. You think a couple of stolen files will bring me down? I own this city. One phone call, and every lawyer in town will bury you before you even step into a courtroom. Sarah's stomach twisted, but Rachel didn't back down. You might control the legal system, but you don't control public opinion. She pulled out her phone and in one swift motion, hit a button on the screen. Vincent's smirk faltered. What did you just do? Rachel smiled. A live upload. Every document we found is already in the hands of investigative journalists, and I made sure to tag the city's biggest tenant rights organizations. By morning, the world will know exactly who you are. For the first time, Vincent's confidence wavered. His jaw clenched, his face paling. You have no idea what you've just done. Sarah felt a surge of power she hadn't felt in years. No, Vincent, she said, her voice strong. You have no idea what we've just done. A loud knock suddenly echoed from the hallway. Mr. Carter? A deep voice called from outside. This is the police. We need you to open the door. Vincent's eyes darted between them and the door. His breath came faster now, his perfect world unraveling before him. Rachel crossed her arms. I took the liberty of making sure the right people saw your files first. They've been waiting for an excuse to investigate you. Sarah swallowed hard, watching as Vincent's expression twisted in fury. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the door burst open, and two uniformed officers stepped inside. Vincent Carter, one of them said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. You're under arrest for fraud, illegal evictions, and embezzlement. Sarah exhaled, feeling the weight of years of struggle finally start to lift. The nightmare was over, but her new life was just beginning. The days that followed Vincent's arrest moved in a blur. News outlets were all over the story. Headlines flashing across screens, documenting the fall of the once untouchable landlord. He was charged with multiple counts of fraud, illegal evictions, and money laundering. His empire crumbled as quickly as it had been built, and it was all because of Rachel's bravery and Sarah's unwavering determination to protect her family. Sarah couldn't remember the last time she'd felt this much relief, but with it came a new kind of fear. The fear of what came next, of starting over from nothing. As the media storm surrounding Vincent's arrest died down, Sarah stood on the porch of her old apartment, still the only place she had ever truly called home. It was a strange feeling. For years, it had been a symbol of her struggle, her sacrifice, and her fight for a future. But now, as she looked around, it was just a place, no longer a battleground. Rachel stood beside her, her arm around Sarah's shoulders. "You did it," she said, a soft smile breaking through the exhaustion. "You're free." Sarah nodded, though a knot still tightened in her chest. "But for how long?" she murmured. "Everything is still a mess. I have to figure out where we're going next." Rachel squeezed her tighter. "You don't have to figure it all out today. We'll take it one step at a time. You've been through so much already. Let's just focus on the now." Just then, Emma came running down the stairs, a wide grin spreading across her face. "Mom, guess what?" Sarah turned to her daughter, her heart swelling. "What, sweeties?" "We don't have to leave." Emma's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Dad's old lawyer is helping us fight to keep the house. They said we might even get a refund for all the rent Vincent took from us unfairly." Sarah blinked, disbelieving for a moment. She hadn't expected such good news, not after everything. But here it was, a chance at redemption, at getting back what they'd lost. Rachel smiled, her eyes gleaming with pride. "I told you, Sarah. Fate has a funny way of working itself out." Sarah stood still for a moment, absorbing the weight of it all. Her life had been defined by one injustice after another, but now, for the first time in years, she felt like she was truly standing on her own 2 feet. It wasn't perfect. There would be more hurdles to overcome, more struggles ahead. But for now, there was peace. She looked at Emma, her heart aching with love. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. Emma beamed. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah allowed herself to believe it too. The next few months passed in a whirlwind. Vincent's assets were seized, and the tenants who had suffered under his rule were offered compensation. Rachel helped Sarah navigate the complicated legal processes, and with the help of the media coverage, they were able to rally support from tenant advocacy groups. Soon, other landlords who had been taking advantage of their tenants were forced to answer for their actions as well. For Sarah, the victory was bittersweet. The home she'd fought so hard to protect wasn't just a physical space. It was a symbol of the strength she'd found within herself. And as she and Emma began to rebuild their lives, Sarah couldn't help but feel grateful for everything she had learned throughout the ordeal. There were days when it still felt overwhelming, when the future seemed uncertain, but Sarah had learned how to face those days with courage. And as long as she had Rachel by her side, there was nothing they couldn't overcome. Sarah wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. As the weeks went by, Sarah watched as her life slowly began to heal. She had always been a fighter, but after the battle with Vincent, she felt a sense of calm she hadn't known in years. Every time she stepped into her home, she felt a deep gratitude, the weight of the past finally lifting. It wasn't just a house that had been saved. It was the future she could now build for herself and Emma. One afternoon, as Sarah sat at the kitchen table, sorting through the final legal papers that would restore their lives, Emma came running in with a piece of paper clutched in her hands. "Mom, look, I got a scholarship." Emma's voice was filled with pure joy. Sarah's heart swelled with pride as she took the letter from Emma's hands. It was a scholarship for a prestigious art school, one Emma had dreamed about attending for years. The thought of her daughter's future now being filled with possibilities she hadn't dared to hope for made Sarah's heart race. "I knew you could do it," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. She pulled Emma into a tight embrace. Emma grinned, her eyes sparkling. "This is just the beginning, Mom. We're going to make everything work." Rachel had been by their side through every twist and turn, and now, as Sarah looked around her home, her safe haven once more, she realized how far they had all come. From the brink of losing everything, they had found strength in each other. As Sarah reflected on the events that had brought them here, she couldn't help but think about the lessons learned. The value of perseverance, the power of standing up for what was right, and the importance of family. She had learned that no matter how broken life seemed, no matter how dark the path ahead appeared, there was always a way through. Sarah looked out the window, where the sun was setting on another peaceful evening. Her life was far from perfect, but it was hers. And that was enough. "Here's to new beginnings," she whispered, raising a glass of water in a quiet toast to herself. The door creaked open, and Emma bounded into the room, her excitement still bubbling over. "Guess what, Mom? I want to start an art project. I have so many ideas, and now I can actually afford the supplies." Sarah smiled. "That's the spirit, sweetheart. Let's get started." The weight of everything they had been through, the eviction, the fight for justice, the fear of the unknown, was still there, but it didn't feel as heavy anymore. Together, they had not only survived but thrived. And for the first time in a long while, Sarah allowed herself to dream again. Dream of a future filled with hope, a future where the past was no longer a chain holding her down, but a foundation beneath her feet. The story of Sarah, Emma, and Rachel wasn't one of easy triumph, but one of resilience, courage, and the unshakable belief that sometimes life's greatest challenges lead to its most beautiful victories. The chapter on Vincent Carter was closed. But for Sarah and Emma, the next chapter was just beginning.